You know, in the legal world, pretty much every right you have is on a timer. But what happens when the person who needs to use that right simply can't? I mean, what if they're a kid? That's exactly what we're diving into today. This really fascinating legal idea that's all about making sure a deadline doesn't turn into a deep injustice.
So just imagine this for a second. You have a right to sue somebody, but there's a deadline. That sounds fair enough. But what if you just can't? What if you're not mentally or physically able to file a lawsuit? Or what if you're just a child? Does it seem fair that the clock would just run out on you? Well, that's the big question we're going to tackle.
So here's our game plan. First, we'll talk about the problem itself, what I'm calling the law's ticking clock. Then we'll get into the brilliant solution, this thing called legal disability. We'll see how it hits the pause button, what happens in some tricky situations like when disabilities overlap, or even if the person passes away. And then we're going to finish with the one rule that you just can't break.
All right, first things first. Before we can even talk about pausing this clock, we really need to understand what it is and, why it exists in the first place.
Okay, so in a nutshell, almost every legal right to sue someone has an expiration date. It's officially called the limitation period. If you miss that deadline, your right to sue is just gone. The whole point is to make sure legal disputes get resolved and people don't have the threat of a lawsuit hanging over their heads forever. So, faced with this problem of fairness, what does the law do? Well, it comes up with a really powerful idea, found in Section 6 of India's Limitation Act, that basically acts as a shield for people who can't fight for themselves. And it's called legal disability. The best way to think about it is like the law's official pause button. The law basically says, hey, we recognize that some people just aren't in a position to stand up for their rights. So for them, it puts the whole limitation period on hold. The clock doesn't even start. Now, the law is super specific about who gets to hit this pause button. There are really only three categories. First, being a minor, so anyone under 18, and then two others, being insane or being an idiot. Now, I know those last two are really old legal terms, and they have very specific meanings here that we need to break down.
And this distinction is absolutely crucial. See, in this legal context, insane means a temporary state. Someone could be sane, become insane, and then, hopefully, become sane again. Idiot, on the other hand, legally refers to a permanent condition, something that's usually present from birth, where a person is just fundamentally unable to manage their own life and affairs.
Okay, so we've got our pause button, but how does it actually work in a simple, everyday case? Let's look at the basic rule for someone with just one disability. You know, the principle here is just beautifully simple. If you're under a legal disability when your right to sue pops up, that ticking clock is frozen in time. It will only start ticking from the exact moment that disability is over. Let's make this real. Say a 5-year-old has a legal right to sue someone. The clock is paused for their entire childhood. The very day they turn 18, boom, their legal disability as a minor is officially over, and it's only then that the clock, let's say it's a 3-year limitation period, finally starts to run. But of course, life isn't always that straightforward, is it? Things can get complicated. So what happens if someone is dealing with more than one of these disabilities? Well, the law actually thinks about this in two different ways. First, you could have two disabilities at the exact same time, like a child who is also suffering from insanity. Or you could have one disability that is immediately, with no break in between, followed by another one.
And here is where the law is incredibly generous. It says the clock won't start until both or all of the disabilities are gone. So, in our example, if a minor also becomes insane before they turn 18, the clock does not start on their 18th birthday. It just waits. It will only begin to tick after they're both an adult and they've regained their sanity.
This brings up another really important question. I mean, the law protects a person while they're disabled, but what if they never get better? What happens if they pass away while they're still under that disability? So here's the scenario, right? An individual has a right to sue, but they're disabled. They live their whole life with that disability, and then they die. For that person, the limitation clock never, ever started. Not for a single second. So, does that mean the right is just lost, gone forever? What about their family, their heir, what the law calls their legal representative, or LR? Can they step in and pick up the fight? Well, the law gives us a super clear path. When the disabled person dies, you look to their heir. If the heir is totally capable, an adult, sound of mind, the clock starts for them on the day of the death.
But get this, if the heir is also under a legal disability, that same principle of fairness just keeps on going. The clock stays paused for them too until their own disability ends. It's pretty amazing.
All right, now for the final crucial piece of this whole puzzle. We've spent all this time talking about how the clock can be paused before it even starts, but what happens if it's already ticking? This brings us to a huge fundamental rule in all of limitation law. And this is the critical difference. Everything we've talked about so far is for when the disability is there from the very beginning. This rule is about the exact opposite situation. A person is perfectly able to sue, the clock starts ticking, and then, sometime later, they become disabled. And the rule here is just absolute. This is one of the most important concepts to get. Once that clock starts ticking, no disability that happens afterward can stop it. It is now unstoppable. And this is to make sure that cases eventually have an end date and don't just drag on forever.
So, for example, let's say an adult has 3 years to sue someone. The clock starts. A year later, they pass away. Their heir doesn't get a fresh 3 years. Nope, because that clock is unstoppable. The heir gets the right to sue, but they only get the time that was left on the clock. In this case, just 2 years.
Okay, let's wrap this all up. We started with the basic idea of a legal deadline, that ticking clock. Then we saw how legal disability is like a pause button to make things fair. And that pause is generous. It lasts until every single disability is over. We saw how that right can even be passed down to an heir. But the one huge, unbreakable rule to remember is that once that clock starts, there is no stopping it. You know, this whole system is really just a fascinating balancing act. On one hand, you've got this deep desire to protect the most vulnerable people. And on the other, you have this need for things to be final, for the legal system to have some certainty. So the question I'll leave you with is, do you think it works? Does the law strike the right balance? Something to chew on. Thanks so much for tuning in.